Stuart Nash.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I do stand in support of this bill, but I do find it a little rich, Mr. Speaker, I must admit, when someone like Alistair Scott, with all due respect to Mr. Scott, who I think is a man of substantial means, rents a property out of choice. I think that's a little different to a poor family that rents out of economic necessity. I suspect the house that Mr. Scott rents is a little different than some of the houses that we find in South Auckland. But I could be wrong. Maybe Mr. Scott was in a mouldy house with no curtains and no heating, etc., etc. Just doesn't sort of seem right. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, is I have to smile at the ACT member starting to talk about Norman Kirk, a towering man of huge principle. And then at the end of his speech, he says, it is regret that I support this bill. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that Norman Kirk stood up for what he believed in. There is no way that Norman Kirk would have ever done anything just because he felt he had to support another party. He would have stood up, he would have banged the whatever these things are called, the desk, and said, this is what I believe in, this is what I stand for, this is what I am doing. Not like that member, so that's a little disingenuous. I think it's sort of, it's not particularly, it just epitomises what the ACT Party stands for or doesn't. Mr. Speaker, it's generally accepted that that tax legislation of this nature is not there to quell house prices. This sort of tax legislation is there to actually bring people into the tax system that actually are outside the tax system at the moment. And I remember reading a paper in around about 2010 that said the problem of avoidance in the speculative housing industry was around about $250 million a year. That was the size of the issue. It was very big. The IRD recognised the size of the problem. Mr. Speaker, we now have a bill 5 years later that the government says is going to raise about $5 million. This bill fails the test around tax legislation on so many features, on so many areas. But the first one is it does not meet the requirements. It is not there to bring people into the tax system. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, is there is a test at the moment under current tax legislation, and it's called the intent test. What that basically means, if a person has bought a house with the intent of making a capital gain, then they have to pay tax on that at their marginal tax rate. However, if they bought the house with the intention of making a rental yield and then they sell that house, they don't have to pay any tax. It is notoriously difficult to prove someone's intent if they're arguing the other way. What this piece of legislation actually admits is the intent test is not working. Because if it was working, Mr. Speaker, then we wouldn't need legislation in place to capture those who we believe are avoiding tax. But the problem with this is it's only there for 2 years. And what this is called, it's called a lock-in. So someone buys a property, they know that all they have to do is to hold it for 2 years and 1 day, and they can sell it, and they don't have to pay any capital gains. The intent test still exists. But again, what a smart investor does is they always go out and say, I've bought this as a part of a balanced property portfolio or a balanced portfolio. It is there to make a rental yield, and I'm going to hold on to this for as long as necessary. Then they sell it after 2 years. The IRD may come knocking and said, you bought that with the intent of making a capital gain. All the investor has to say is, no, I didn't. Talk to my accountant, talk to my lawyer, talk to my portfolio manager. I bought this with the intention of making a rental yield. And the IRD walks away because they know they will never win that argument in court, Mr. Speaker. The IRD did have a look at this, and they actually ran 2 scenarios. They said, let's try a 2-year scenario and let's try a 5-year scenario. And they actually admitted that a 5-year scenario would have a much better outcome in terms of catching speculators than a 2-year would one. There would still be lock-in, there's no doubt about that. In fact, the Australian capital gains tax, how that worked is if you bought the property before the capital gains tax came in, then you don't have to pay capital gains tax when you sell this property. And that has created a problem in Australia because there's a whole lot of people who own properties for capital gain that they bought way before the capital gains tax came in. This is what will happen with this one, Mr. Speaker. 5 years would have been better. There is no doubt about that. And I have no doubt that Mr. Scott knows this. I have no doubt that Mr. Bailey knows this, because when you look at it, This is capturing $5 million from speculators in an industry where avoidance has been estimated at around $200 million. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, about this piece of legislation is it's retrospective. Now, it was signalled by the government, there's no doubt about that, but if you follow the line that this took, it very much looks like that this was a government making policy on the hoof, and then they thought, well, in order to put effect to this policy, we are going to need to pass legislation. So in effect, Mr. Speaker, anyone who has bought a house on or after the 1st of October, keeping in mind this legislation will probably come in the end of this month, or as soon as it receives royal assent, from the 1st of October, they are actually liable to pay, they come under this 2-year bright line test. This is not a good way to make legislation for 2 reasons. The first one, Mr. Speaker, is who would bother to put a submission in knowing that the government had signalled us that the bill already said it's going to come in on the 1st of October and there's nothing you can do about this. This was a fait accompli. The fact that we had tax advisors, the fact that we had large accountancy companies, the fact that we had legal firms coming and saying this is not fit for purpose, I think they did it because they felt they needed to be heard, knowing that odds of them making a difference were remote. But at least they came to the Select Committee and said, this piece of legislation does not give effect to the government's policy. This will not have the intended effect that we need in the Auckland housing market, and it will not raise the level of revenue for the government that a well thought out bright line test would. The second thing I would say, Mr. Speaker, oh no, not the second, the third thing I would say, or even fourth, is that, is that I think that the main home exclusion is unclear. There are so many points about this bill. Can I have 20 minutes to speak on this? There are so many points about this bill that just aren't right. It uses that famous legal term, quote, if the land has been used predominantly for most of the time. If the land has been used predominantly for most of the time, is that a test in terms of if it's a family home or not, or the greatest connection? Now, Mr. Bishop always says that, well, there is a legal definition for this. It has been determined in the courts, and we know that if it is bad legislation, then judges will have to determine what parliamentarians meant. And my view is that judges should not have to determine what Parliament meant when it passed legislation, because that legislation should be so clear that we don't need to take it to court. But this will be taken to court. And again, it creates uncertainty, it creates ambiguity, and which is not great tax legislation in any way, shape or form. It fails yet another one of the tests. Another point, Mr. Speaker, is I don't think the family home test actually meets 21st century reality. And by that I mean, if you sell 2 or more family homes within the 2-year period, then you come under this test. Now, me, myself, Mr. Speaker, I got a job in Taupo with Fletcher Challenge, and then I moved to Auckland, and then we sold that house, and we bought another one. This is in my younger days when I could afford to buy Auckland homes. I would have been caught under that test, and there was no way at all that I was speculating in property. I was just buying a family home. So to wrap up, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this bill. I think this is a very poor process in terms of creating tax legislation. I do not think that this piece of legislation will have the desired effect that the government wanted it to have. I think that the government could have done a lot more in terms of revenue raising, in terms of addressing the core issue, which is people avoiding paying tax, and also, Mr. Speaker, an unintended consequence in terms of just putting a bit of a cooling on the Auckland house market. It is not good legislation, and I hope that the government will come up with something more substantial, which is actually going to meet the requirements of the IRD, of Aucklanders and of New Zealanders. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker. Andrew Bailey.
Thank you very much, Mr.